Also, as some of you may or may not know, my grandmother passed away back in the beginning of May. She was just days away from her 100th birthday. I did a video previously talking about that experience and what the COVID-19 restrictions really did to stifle family gathering for my grandma's funeral. Now, the old saying goes that the older a person is, the higher the likelihood that they're going to have a smaller funeral. And that's understandable. It wouldn't have been as small as it was if it wasn't for the COVID-19 restrictions, I'll say that. But I want to juxtapose my grandmother's funeral and the celebration of her life with, frankly, that of George Floyd, who was memorialized in really what is ostensibly at least 3, if not more, funeral celebrations and memorials in the United States. I'm not going to get into the reality surrounding or the facts surrounding the death of George Floyd, other than to say that it's tragic. He died. He was in police custody, and anytime that happens, it's horrible for the officers involved. It's horrible for the agency that those officers work for, and worse still, it's horrible for the man's or the individual's family and friends, people who know him well. It doesn't matter if a death is the result of justifiable use of force or a situation where it's hard to tell if it's justifiable, or if the case is clearly an abuse of power. The death of a person in custody is horrible. It's horrible. It has long-term detrimental effects on everybody involved, and you can never get back that lost loved one. Here in Minnesota, George Floyd was memorialized by, in many cases, very peaceful protesters. People who legitimately had a right to be asking questions and concerned about what had happened and why George died. But all of this went on with the full backing and support of our governor, who had ordered, mind you, by way of fiat edicts, that no one gather, that no one be allowed to gather or even be allowed to meet in person in large numbers. And those peaceful protests eventually turned into violent upheaval and riots, seeing massive parts of Minneapolis utterly destroyed, and millions upon millions of dollars of damage being done, and our governor doing little to nothing, or next to nothing, to step in and shut the protests down, the violence down. Now, part of me wants to juxtapose the response of the media to both the riots and the protest, as they gushed on and on about how powerful it was to see people rise up in resistance to tyranny at the hands of police, and praise these protesters, and actually praise the rioters too for being outraged and gathering and fighting back. And I want to juxtapose that position from what the media did with the truly peaceful protests and rallies that were staged here in Minnesota by people who were decrying the governor's abuse of his own power and his overreach, and really the governor's hand in the death of many elderly people who were exposed to COVID-19 because care centers were basically forced to take COVID-19 positive people into the confines of their facilities, thereby exposing the weakest people and the most vulnerable people, the people most susceptible to COVID-19. And they died as a result of that, and they continue to die in Minnesota as a result of that. That's the largest percentage of deaths makes up the elderly in care centers in the state of Minnesota. If you don't believe me, look it up. It's true. But even there, I don't want to really dwell on that. What I do want to talk about is not the hypocrisy of the media, but the hypocrisy of Commissar Walz, who shut down everything in the state of Minnesota, a man who shut down churches, for lack of better terminology. Many churches felt they didn't have a choice but to comply with the state or really lose their freedom. Comply to losing your freedom or lose your freedom. I sometimes don't understand how Christians think. But small businesses were destroyed. All sorts of public gatherings were shut down and canceled, and many are still not going to happen, even though the state is ostensibly open to back up. But yet, protests and riots continued, were applauded. The governor taking part in at least one protest for the photo op, if you ask me. But the worst of it is, as George Floyd was memorialized here, and everybody knows that man had a right to be memorialized. His friends and family had a right to remember him, to celebrate his life, and to grieve over his death. But the memorial service here in Minnesota was hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people, inside and outside of the building. And our governor, Commissar Tim Walz, Comrade Walz, said, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence." Well, Tim, my grandmother's death is a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. I don't know if you're aware of this, Governor, but people die once, and then they face judgment. But, I mean, the scriptures, the thing that drives me to do this work with my channel and with the Facebook page, it's appointed unto man once to die and then face judgment. George Floyd died once. My grandmother died once. Why was George Floyd allowed a massive memorial here? Not just in the state of Minnesota, but in an urban area packed full of people. Why did he get to have a memorial service that was massive, that clearly exposed people to COVID-19? I'm sorry, there's no way in the world that I'm going to believe that all of the restrictions that have been placed on everybody else somehow prevented the COVID-19 spread, but those same restrictions, as they were ignored for the George Floyd memorial. And you can say they weren't, but everybody knows that social distancing and mask wearing were very, very sparsely observed there. There again, not even talking about the impact of the riots and the protests, but just that memorial service. How dare you, Governor, talk about the importance of this once-in-a-lifetime event for George Floyd's death and ignore the hundreds of people who have lost loved ones, who had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to gather and memorialize and celebrate their lives and to grieve together. How dare you, Governor? You are a monster, and you are a hypocrite. And I wish people would wake up and see that. But for some strange reason, the people of Minnesota, who really are a rugged people, for the most part, or always have been, have become panty-waisted, effeminate, emasculated people, and they'll do whatever you tell them to do because you have them absolutely terrified that they're going to get sick and die if they don't do what Governor Walz tells them to do. So you get to strip away from other people the once-in-a-lifetime occurrence, a once-in-a-lifetime event to remember their loved ones, while flaunting another event because it fits your agenda. And quite frankly, it works to separate and drive a wedge between the regular people and those that you seek to idolize and memorialize as heroes. My grandmother was no less of a productive citizen than George Floyd. My grandmother worked her entire life, labored with her hands, and she died alone in a care center. And then she was memorialized basically alone because of the restrictions that you put in place, Governor Walz. Well, then a month later, you broke your own rules to feed the hype that somehow he was more important than my grandmother. And I don't care if this upsets people. I don't care if people see this and think that I'm being a radical. I don't care if this is labeled wrong think and this upsets people and they come after me. Let them cancel me. I'm a nobody. But George Floyd was no more important than my grandmother. His friends and family are no more important than I am. He just fit an agenda. He's a pawn to you, just like everybody else up in the Twin Cities is a pawn to your agenda right now. And the rest of the Minnesotan people are just going along with it. But sooner or later, Governor, people are going to wake up and they're going to be tired of it. They're going to be tired of being used as pawns in your game. The problem is that the rest of us are never going to get back what we lost because of your restrictions and your hypocritical, two-faced standards. Minnesota needs to wake up. It's time for you to go, Governor. It's time for you to, at the very least, relinquish this power you've taken to yourself. Two, it's time for you to go because you have made such a mockery of the office and you have done so much damage, not just to the economy, but to the mentality and the psyche of the people of Minnesota. You have stripped from the people you're supposed to watch out for so many things. And in the case of some families, the freedom to say goodbye to someone they love once in a lifetime. As always, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for being open-minded. Thanks for listening. I would ask that over here in the corner, somewhere on your screen, you hit the subscribe button. It's important, not for me, but because mainstream media, legacy media, isn't going to get the word out. They're not going to let people who don't toe the established line speak. So for the sake of liberty and for the sake of the defense of this nation, small little independent voices like mine need to be heard, especially the interviews. It's got very little to do with my commentary and a lot more to do with the interviews and the people who are affected when liberties are tread on. So once again, hit the subscribe button, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much.